They had spent 3 years authenticating the painting. Claire Whitmore needed less than 3 seconds to realize something was wrong. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe truth matters more than status, be sure to like and subscribe. Now, back to Claire Whitmore. The grand exhibition hall of the Callaway collection glowed beneath warm amber lights, every polished surface reflecting wealth, prestige, and certainty. Reporters adjusted cameras. Art critics exchanged quiet observations. Wealthy collectors stood with glasses of sparkling water in hand, admiring the masterpiece that dominated the center wall. According to experts, the painting was one of the most important discoveries of the decade. According to headlines, it was worth $50 million. According to everyone in the room, it was absolutely authentic. Everyone except the woman standing on a maintenance ladder with a microfiber cloth tucked into her back pocket. Claire Whitmore moved quietly through the gallery before opening hours, doing the kind of work nobody noticed unless it wasn't done correctly. Dusting frames, cleaning display glass, checking for fingerprints. The visitors who would soon fill the room rarely looked at people like her. To them, she was simply part of the building, another invisible worker keeping everything spotless behind the scenes. Claire preferred it that way. Invisible people heard things. Invisible people noticed things. Invisible people learned to pay attention. She reached the massive gilded frame and carefully brushed away a thin layer of dust from the lower corner. The painting itself appeared flawless. Rich oxide pigments, delicate craquelure patterns, a surface aged to perfection. Exactly what collectors expected to see in a masterpiece believed to be more than a century old. Then something caught her eye. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. In fact, nobody else in the room would have noticed it. A tiny strand protruded from beneath the edge of the paint layer near the canvas fold. Claire froze. The cloth slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the hardwood floor. Her blue eyes narrowed. For a moment, she simply stared. Then she leaned closer. Much closer. The fiber was thin, pale, almost invisible against the aged canvas. But there was something about its texture that made her stomach tighten. Her pulse quickened. The room around her faded away. The voices, the lights, the expensive decorations. None of it mattered anymore. Because she recognized that fiber. She had seen thousands of them before. Modern synthetic canvas fibers. The kind that should not exist anywhere near a painting supposedly created decades before such materials were commercially available. Claire swallowed hard. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe years of handling artworks had made her overly cautious. Yet the uncomfortable feeling remained. The fiber shouldn't be there. It simply shouldn't exist beneath an original oxide paint layer. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small magnifying loupe she often carried while cleaning delicate surfaces. She examined the strand again. Her heartbeat became louder with every second. The synthetic structure was unmistakable. Claire felt a chill move through her chest. Across the gallery, workers continued preparing for the evening's unveiling. They laughed. They chatted. They carried equipment and floral arrangements. Nobody realized that a woman everyone ignored had just discovered a detail capable of shaking the entire art world. Claire stepped down from the ladder, unable to take her eyes off the painting. If she was right, the masterpiece worth $50 million wasn't a masterpiece at all. And somewhere behind layers of prestige, reputation, and expert opinions, a very dangerous mistake had been hiding in plain sight. Claire Whitmore did not move for nearly 10 seconds. The fiber remained exactly where it was, small enough to escape almost any inspection, yet impossible for her to ignore. Around her, the gallery continued preparing for the evening event as if nothing had happened. A technician adjusted lighting above the central display. Two assistants discussed seating arrangements for important guests. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rolled across polished marble floors. Life continued normally. Only Claire felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She carefully placed the magnifying loupe back into her pocket and stepped away from the painting. Experience had taught her something important years ago. The moment emotion enters an observation, mistakes follow. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Assumptions did not. She took a slow breath and forced herself to walk toward the maintenance office at the rear of the building. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even looked up. That was the strange thing about Claire's life. She had worked inside some of the most prestigious museums and private collections in the country, standing inches away from artworks worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet most people never remembered her face. To visitors, she was simply part of the background. To executives, she was maintenance staff. To wealthy collectors, she barely existed. Few people knew that before life took an unexpected turn, Claire had spent 4 years studying art conservation at a respected university in Boston. She had loved every minute of it. Pigment analysis, canvas dating, restoration science, material history. She absorbed it all. Her professors often praised her attention to detail. One of them used to say that Claire noticed things other people walked past every day. But talent did not always guarantee opportunity. When her father became ill during her final year, tuition bills and medical expenses arrived faster than scholarships could help. Claire left school to support her family and never returned. Years passed. The degree remained unfinished. The dreams remained unfinished. Yet the knowledge never disappeared. Every painting she cleaned became another lesson. Every museum became another classroom. Every forgotten corner of every gallery sharpened her eye even further. She entered the small maintenance room and sat down at a metal desk. Sunlight filtered through a narrow window. Her hands rested motionless for a moment. Then she reached for her notebook. Claire had developed a habit of documenting unusual observations immediately. Date, time, location, environmental conditions, material concerns. She wrote everything. Carefully. Her handwriting remained steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Modern synthetic fiber visible beneath oxide paint layer near lower right canvas fold. Potential inconsistency with documented creation period. Observation requires verification. She stared at the sentence after writing it. The words seemed unreal. Across the city, newspapers were already preparing articles celebrating the collection's newest acquisition. Experts had authenticated it. Investors had endorsed it. Insurance companies had valued it. Entire careers stood behind its legitimacy. And yet one tiny fiber threatened to unravel everything. Claire closed the notebook slowly. Deep down, she hoped she was wrong. Because if she was right, the problem was far larger than a single painting. And for the first time that morning, a troubling question entered her mind. If such an obvious inconsistency existed, how had every expert missed it? By late afternoon, the Callaway collection no longer resembled a museum. It looked more like the center of the art world. Black luxury vehicles lined the street outside. Television crews unloaded equipment near the entrance. Photographers adjusted lenses while reporters rehearsed introductions in front of the building's elegant stone facade. Inside, every detail had been carefully orchestrated. Fresh floral arrangements stood beneath crystal lighting. Security personnel greeted arriving guests. Waitstaff moved silently between exhibits carrying trays of sparkling water and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere carried the unmistakable energy of an event people would talk about for years. Claire Whitmore watched from a distance as preparations accelerated around her. She stood near a service hallway holding a clipboard, invisible as always. Nobody asked her opinion. Nobody noticed the concern hidden behind her calm expression. Across the main gallery, the painting remained the center of attention. Visitors gathered around it even before the official unveiling began. Some admired the brushwork. Others discussed its historical significance. A few simply wanted photographs standing beside something worth more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Claire listened carefully. Every conversation sounded the same. Confidence, certainty, admiration. Nobody expressed even the slightest doubt. Then a sudden shift in movement swept through the room. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. Cameras lifted. Adrian Callaway had arrived. Even among successful people, Adrian possessed a presence that drew attention effortlessly. At 38 years old, he had built a reputation as one of the country's most respected private collectors. Tall, composed, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, he moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. He was not loud. He did not need to be. Success seemed to follow him naturally. Investors greeted him warmly. Curators shook his hand. Journalists competed for a few moments of his attention. Yet Adrian remained focused on the painting. As he approached the display, pride briefly softened his otherwise controlled expression. 3 years. That was how long he had pursued this acquisition. 3 years of negotiations, research, legal reviews, and authentication studies. Tonight represented the culmination of that effort. For Adrian, the painting was more than an investment. It was proof that his collection belonged among the finest in the world. Claire studied him from across the gallery. She almost felt sorry for him, not because of who he was, but because of what he did not know. A nearby television screen displayed promotional footage detailing the painting's journey to the collection. Experts appeared one after another praising its authenticity. Scientific testing, historical documentation, provenance records. Every piece of evidence seemed airtight. Every authority agreed. Every conclusion pointed to the same answer. Genuine. Original. Extraordinary. Claire's stomach tightened. The more she listened, the more impossible her observations seemed. Could one tiny fiber truly outweigh years of expert analysis? Could she be misunderstanding something fundamental? She wanted to believe that possibility. Yet the image of that synthetic strand remained vivid in her mind. She had seen it clearly. The structure, the texture, the material composition, none of it belonged in a canvas supposedly created generations earlier. As applause erupted near the main stage, Claire looked once more toward the display. The painting glowed beneath carefully positioned lights while hundreds of influential eyes admired it with complete confidence. Standing alone near the service corridor, she felt smaller than ever. Yet beneath the uncertainty growing inside her, another feeling quietly emerged. Curiosity. Because if every expert was right, she had made the biggest mistake of her career. But if she was right, an entire room full of experts was about to discover something they never expected. The applause continued around the gallery, but Claire Whitmore barely heard it. Her mind had traveled years into the past, back to a conservation laboratory in Boston where Professor Harold Bennett stood before a group of students holding two nearly identical canvas samples. Most of the class had failed the exercise. Claire had not. She still remembered the professor's words as clearly as if he were standing beside her now. Art can lie. Materials do not. At the time, she had been 21, exhausted from working evening shifts to pay tuition, yet fascinated by the hidden science beneath every masterpiece. Professor Bennett specialized in forensic authentication. While other instructors focused on artistic movements and historical context, he taught students to trust physical evidence above reputation. Canvas fibers, pigment composition, binding agents, manufacturing methods. Tiny details invisible to casual observers often revealed truths that entire institutions overlooked. Claire remembered sitting in the front row while he projected microscopic images onto a screen. Natural linen fibers appeared irregular, organic, imperfect. Synthetic fibers looked different, cleaner, more uniform, manufactured. Impossible to mistake once someone understood what to look for. One particular lecture suddenly returned to her with startling clarity. A famous forgery case involving a painting that had fooled collectors for years. The counterfeit artist had mastered brushwork, aging techniques, and historical pigments. Experts praised it. Museums displayed it. Wealthy buyers competed for ownership. Yet the deception collapsed because of a few microscopic synthetic fibers hidden beneath a paint layer. Materials that did not exist when the artwork was supposedly created. Claire's stomach tightened. The similarity was impossible to ignore. She quietly left the crowd and entered a restricted records room near the conservation department. The exhibition had created enough distraction that nobody questioned her presence. Shelves filled with catalogs and authentication reports lined the walls. She found a computer terminal and logged into the collection database. Her fingers moved carefully across the keyboard. The painting's restoration history appeared on screen. Previous inspections, transport records, environmental reports, scientific analyses, hundreds of pages documenting every stage of ownership. Claire reviewed each section methodically. Everything appeared flawless. Carbon dating results supported the timeline. Pigment analysis matched historical expectations. Provenance records stretched back decades. It was the kind of documentation experts dreamed about finding. Yet something felt wrong. She continued reading until one report caught her attention. A restoration performed approximately 12 years earlier. The treatment focused on surface stabilization and varnish removal. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But one sentence made her pause. Limited examination of canvas substrate due to preservation concerns. Claire read the line twice. Then a third time. Her pulse quickened. If the substrate had never undergone comprehensive fiber analysis, the synthetic strand she observed might have remained undiscovered all these years. She leaned back slowly. Outside the records room, guests celebrated what they believed was a historic acquisition. Inside, a maintenance employee sat staring at a screen, realizing that one unanswered question had somehow survived more than a decade of expert scrutiny. And the more she studied the reports, the less confident she became that the experts had actually looked where the truth was hiding. Claire stared at the screen for another moment before making a decision that could easily cost her job. She closed the database, picked up her notebook, and walked back toward the main gallery. The celebration had grown louder. Reporters moved through the crowd collecting reactions. Guests admired the collection while discussing market values and future exhibitions. Nobody seemed interested in uncertainty. They had come to celebrate certainty. Claire crossed the room and approached a woman named Victoria Reynolds, the collection's senior operations manager. Victoria had worked with the organization for more than 15 years and was known for maintaining strict control over every detail. If there was anyone Claire was supposed to report concerns to, it was her. "Ms. Reynolds, do you have a moment?" Claire asked politely. Victoria barely looked up from the tablet in her hands. "Make it quick. We are on a very tight schedule." Claire nodded. "I noticed something unusual on the featured painting." That immediately caught Victoria's attention, though not in the way Claire hoped. "Unusual how?" Claire chose her words carefully. "There appears to be a synthetic fiber visible beneath the paint layer. I reviewed the restoration records, and I do not see evidence of a comprehensive substrate examination. I think it may deserve another look." For a brief second, Victoria simply stared at her. Then she laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to signal disbelief. "You think the painting deserves another look?" she repeated. Claire felt heat rising in her face. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria folded her arms. "Claire, do you understand how many experts examined that piece?" "I do." "Do you understand how many laboratories authenticated it?" "Yes." "Do you understand that some of the most respected specialists in the world have reviewed its history?" Claire swallowed. "I understand that too." Victoria sighed and shook her head. "Then I think we are done here." Claire remained standing. "I am not saying they are wrong. I am saying there may be something they missed." Unfortunately, several nearby staff members had overheard the conversation. One of them chuckled. Another exchanged an amused glance with a coworker. Within seconds, the attention spread. A young assistant curator stepped closer. "Wait," he said with a grin. "Are we seriously questioning the authentication because maintenance found a thread?" A few people laughed. Claire's stomach tightened. "I am questioning the material, not the authentication." The assistant curator smiled even wider. "That is the same thing." More laughter followed. The sound was not aggressive, but it carried a message Claire understood perfectly. She did not belong in this conversation. She was the person who cleaned the gallery. She was the person who dusted frames. She was not the person who challenged internationally recognized experts. Victoria finally ended the discussion. "Thank you for your concern, Claire. Please return to your assigned duties." The words were professional. The meaning was unmistakable. Conversation over. Claire nodded slowly and stepped away. Behind her, the event continued as if nothing had happened. Yet as she walked toward the service corridor, she heard one final comment drift through the air. "Next thing you know, the janitor will be teaching art history." More laughter followed. Claire kept walking, her eyes lowered toward the notebook in her hand. The humiliation stung more than she wanted to admit. But beneath the embarrassment, something else refused to disappear. The fiber. Because no matter how many people laughed, it was still there. Claire did not go home after the event ended. Long after the last guests departed and the gallery lights dimmed, she remained inside the building. The laughter from earlier still echoed in her memory, but embarrassment had gradually been replaced by determination. Facts did not care about titles. Facts did not care about reputations. Facts simply existed. And if the evidence supported her concern, then she needed to know the truth. Near midnight, the conservation wing stood almost empty. Most employees had already left. Only a handful of security staff remained on duty. Claire returned to the records room carrying a cup of coffee and a notebook filled with observations. She sat at the same terminal and began reviewing every available image associated with the painting. High-resolution photographs, infrared scans, surface analysis reports, layer examinations. Hundreds of files stretched across multiple years. The process was slow. Sometimes she spent 15 minutes studying a single image. Other times, she compared dozens of records searching for one overlooked detail. Hour after hour passed. Outside the windows, the city lights reflected against the glass. Inside, only the glow of the computer illuminated the room. Around 1:30 in the morning, Claire found something unusual. An archived restoration image taken 12 years earlier showed a small section near the lower canvas fold. The resolution was poor compared to modern standards, but she immediately recognized the area. It was the same location where she had noticed the synthetic strand. Claire enlarged the image, then enlarged it again. Her heartbeat quickened. There appeared to be a subtle distortion beneath the paint layer. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to suggest that the underlying material differed slightly from the surrounding canvas. She opened another report, then another. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Different experts had examined pigments. Others had reviewed historical documentation. Several had focused on varnish aging. Yet very few records addressed the substrate itself. It was as if everyone had concentrated on the painting, while almost nobody studied the surface supporting it. Claire turned another page in her notebook. Beside her earlier observations, she began adding new notes. Incomplete substrate analysis. Repeated reliance on prior authentication conclusions. Potential material inconsistency documented but unexplored. She stopped writing and stared at the words. The evidence remained circumstantial. She knew that. Nothing she had found proved fraud. Not yet. But the questions were multiplying faster than the answers. Then she remembered something else from Professor Bennett's lectures. The most successful mistakes survive because people stop asking questions. Claire leaned back in her chair and rubbed her tired eyes. For the first time all day, she no longer felt alone in her concern. The documents themselves seemed to be pointing toward the same possibility. Not certainty, not proof, but possibility. She glanced at the clock. 2:17 in the morning. Most people would have gone home hours ago. Most people would have accepted the opinions of recognized authorities and moved on. Claire closed one report and opened another. Somewhere inside thousands of pages of records, a truth was hiding. And the deeper she searched, the more convinced she became that someone had overlooked something very important. The next morning, Claire Whitmore arrived at the collection running on less than 4 hours of sleep. Her eyes felt heavy, but her mind remained sharp. The documents she reviewed overnight had only strengthened her concerns. She knew she still lacked definitive proof, yet the unanswered questions were becoming impossible to ignore. As she entered the main gallery, she immediately noticed unusual activity near the featured exhibit. Camera crews had returned. Additional reporters filled the room. More importantly, a familiar face stood beside the painting. Dr. Leonard Graves. Even people outside the art world recognized the name. He was one of the most respected authentication specialists in the country, a best-selling author whose opinions influenced museums, auction houses, and private collectors across the globe. If Dr. Graves declared a painting authentic, most people considered the discussion finished. Claire stopped several feet away and listened. A small crowd had gathered around him. Journalists held microphones while guests watched attentively. Dr. Graves smiled confidently as he spoke. I have personally reviewed the scientific documentation associated with this work. The provenance is exceptional. The pigment analysis is consistent. The aging characteristics are entirely appropriate. In my professional opinion, this is one of the most significant discoveries of the century. Several reporters nodded while taking notes. Cameras flashed. More praise followed. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Then one journalist asked a question. Dr. Graves, there have been rumors that a staff member raised concerns about the canvas. A few people laughed quietly. Dr. Graves raised an eyebrow. Rumors travel faster than evidence. The crowd chuckled. Is there any validity to those concerns? Another reporter asked. Dr. Graves folded his hands calmly. None whatsoever. Authentication is a complex scientific process. It requires years of specialized training. Unfortunately, people sometimes misunderstand isolated observations and draw incorrect conclusions. Claire felt dozens of eyes turning toward her. Someone had clearly identified her as the source of the concern. The room suddenly felt smaller. Dr. Graves continued. One visible anomaly does not outweigh comprehensive analysis performed by qualified experts. If it did, Every museum in America would be rewriting history every week. More laughter followed. This time it was louder. Claire stood frozen. The words were polite. The message was not. He was dismissing her without ever speaking her name. One reporter glanced in her direction. Would you like to respond? Claire opened her mouth, then closed it again. Every eye in the room seemed fixed on her. Curators, journalists, guests, staff. The pressure felt overwhelming. Before she could answer, Dr. Graves smiled and shook his head. I think we should leave authentication to professionals. The crowd laughed once more. The sound struck harder than Claire expected. She looked down at the notebook in her hands. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if she really was wrong? What if she had convinced herself of a problem that did not exist? Yet as the applause resumed around Dr. Graves, another memory surfaced. The synthetic fiber, the incomplete substrate analysis, the overlooked records, facts that still refused to disappear. Claire quietly turned away from the crowd and walked toward the service hallway. Behind her, the celebrated expert continued receiving praise. Ahead of her, uncertainty waited. But one thing had become painfully clear. If she wanted anyone to listen, she would need more than questions. She would need proof. Claire spent the rest of the morning avoiding the main gallery. She completed her assignments quietly, keeping her attention on work while replaying the events of the day in her mind. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. Someone with authority dismissed the concern. Someone with status laughed. Someone reminded her that experts had already spoken. By early afternoon, she found herself in a restricted storage corridor reviewing inventory tags when two voices drifted from around the corner. She recognized one immediately. Adrian Calloway. The other belonged to Victoria Reynolds. Claire had no intention of listening, but one sentence stopped her cold. The rumors need to disappear, Victoria said. Adrian's voice remained calm. Rumors usually disappear on their own when they are false. There was a brief silence. With respect, Victoria replied. The staff member who raised the concern is creating unnecessary distraction. Claire lowered her eyes and quietly continued organizing supplies. Which staff member? Adrian asked. Claire Whitmore. Maintenance. Another pause followed. And what exactly is her concern? Victoria sounded almost amused. A synthetic fiber beneath the paint layer. Claire expected the conversation to end there. Instead, Adrian asked another question. Did anyone investigate the claim? Victoria hesitated. Dr. Graves addressed it publicly this morning. That was not my question. The hallway grew quiet. No, Victoria finally admitted. We did not investigate it because the authentication process was already completed years ago. Claire's hands stopped moving. For the first time, someone was asking the question she had been asking herself. Adrian spoke again. Did she provide evidence? Only observations. Did anyone review those observations? Another silence. No. Footsteps approached. Claire quickly focused on a nearby clipboard as Adrian and Victoria entered the corridor. She kept her head down. Adrian slowed as he passed. For a brief moment, his eyes moved toward her. Not dismissively, not impatiently, simply curious. Then he continued walking. The conversation faded into the distance. Claire released a breath she had not realized she was holding. An hour later, she was cleaning display cases near a secondary exhibition room when someone appeared beside her. She looked up and nearly dropped the cloth in her hand. Adrian Calloway stood there. Without reporters. Without advisors. Without the crowd. Just him. Claire Whitmore, he asked. Yes, sir. I understand you have concerns about the collection's newest acquisition. Her pulse quickened. I do. Adrian studied her carefully. Unlike everyone else, he did not smile. He did not laugh. He did not immediately explain why she was wrong. Tell me something, he said. Why are you still pursuing this after what happened this morning? Claire looked down for a moment before answering. Because the material does not match the story. Adrian's expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for her to notice. What does that mean? Claire met his eyes. It means the fiber should not exist beneath that paint layer. If I am wrong, I want to know why. If I am right, everyone else needs to know why. The hallway became very quiet. Adrian looked at her notebook tucked beneath her arm. Then he looked back at her face. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. And for the first time since this began, Claire had the strange feeling that someone important was actually listening. Adrian Calloway glanced once more at the notebook beneath Claire's arm before making a decision that surprised them both. Come with me, he said. Claire blinked. Sir, you said the material does not match the story. I want to hear the full explanation. Her heart began to race. For days she had been trying to get someone to listen. Now the owner of the collection himself was asking questions. Adrian led her through a series of private corridors toward a conference room overlooking the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline while polished wood furniture reflected the afternoon sunlight. Claire hesitated at the doorway. She had spent years cleaning rooms like this. She had never been invited to sit inside one. Adrian noticed her uncertainty. Please, sit. Claire carefully took a seat across from him. A few moments later, Victoria Reynolds entered carrying a tablet. The surprise on her face was impossible to miss. Behind her came Dr. Leonard Graves, whose expression suggested he already knew exactly how the meeting would end. Adrian remained calm. Claire believes there is an inconsistency in the paintings. Construction. I would like to hear her reasoning directly. Victoria exchanged a glance with Dr. Graves. Neither looked pleased. Claire opened her notebook. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that this might be her only opportunity. Adrian checked his watch. You have 10 minutes. The room fell silent. Claire took a breath. The concern began with a visible fiber located beneath the oxide paint layer near the lower canvas fold. Dr. Graves leaned back in his chair. One fiber. Claire ignored the interruption. I reviewed the restoration records and discovered that multiple examinations focused on pigments, varnish, and provenance. However, there was no comprehensive substrate analysis documented. She slid several printed images across the table. This photograph was taken during restoration 12 years ago. The same area shows structural irregularities beneath the paint surface. Adrian studied the image carefully. Victoria crossed her arms. That proves nothing. Not by itself, Claire agreed. But combined with the material characteristics, it raises a question that has never been answered. She turned another page. Synthetic fibers like this became commercially widespread decades after the painting was supposedly created. Dr. Graves smiled thinly. Assuming your identification is correct. Claire looked directly at him. I am willing to test it. The confidence in her voice caught everyone off guard. Even Adrian looked slightly surprised. Claire continued. I am not asking anyone to accept my conclusion. I am asking for verification. The room grew quiet again. Adrian lowered the photographs onto the table. If a verification test were performed, how long would it take? Claire answered immediately. Less than an hour using modern microscopy and material comparison. Victoria sighed. This is becoming ridiculous. But Adrian was no longer looking at Victoria. His attention remained fixed on the documents spread before him. Several seconds passed. Then he slowly closed the folder. Arrange the test, he said. Nobody spoke. Victoria stared at him. Dr. Graves blinked in disbelief. Claire felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Adrian stood and looked toward the window. If the painting is authentic, we lose 1 hour. He turned back toward the room. If it is not, we gain the truth. The silence that followed felt different from every silence Claire had experienced so far. For the first time since she noticed that tiny strand beneath the paint, the question was no longer being ignored. It was about to be answered. Less than 40 minutes later, a small group stood inside the conservation laboratory. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of specialized equipment. Bright examination lights illuminated a work table where the painting now rested beneath protective coverings. Adrian Calloway stood near the back of the room with his arms folded. Victoria Reynolds remained tense and visibly impatient. Dr. Leonard Graves watched with the confidence of a man who expected the outcome to validate everything he had already said. Claire Whitmore stood closest to the workstation, trying to steady her breathing. A senior conservation technician adjusted the microscope and carefully prepared a non-invasive material scan. Nobody spoke much. There was very little left to say. The answers would come from the evidence. The first images appeared on a large monitor mounted to the wall. Magnified sections of the canvas filled the screen. Threads intersected beneath layers of paint, creating a landscape of textures invisible to the naked eye. The technician studied the results carefully. Then he moved to a deeper scan. More images appeared. Layer after layer emerged in remarkable detail. Historical pigments, surface varnish, restoration materials. Everything initially looked consistent with the documentation. Victoria released a quiet breath of relief. Dr. Graves offered a faint smile. Claire felt doubt begin creeping back into her mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had misunderstood everything. Then the technician paused. His expression changed. The room grew still. He adjusted several settings and enlarged a specific section near the lower canvas fold. "Can you zoom further?" Claire asked quietly. The technician nodded. The image expanded again. Adrian stepped closer. A strange pattern appeared beneath the original paint layer. The technician frowned. "That is unusual." Victoria immediately spoke. "Unusual does not mean significant." Nobody responded. The technician continued examining the area. Several moments passed before he switched to another analytical view. This time the monitor displayed structural differences within the substrate itself. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The synthetic strand she had observed was now visible on the screen. Larger, clearer, impossible to ignore. The technician compared the fiber structure against a reference database. Seconds felt like minutes. Finally, a match appeared. Modern polyester blend. Manufactured material. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dr. Graves stared at the screen without blinking. Victoria's face lost all color. Adrian's eyes remained fixed on the results. The technician swallowed. This material could not have been present in a canvas created during the documented period. Claire felt the words settle over the room like a storm cloud. Years of reports. Years of authentication. Years of certainty. All suddenly confronted by one undeniable fact. But the surprises were not over. The technician continued the scan. Additional anomalies began appearing. Beneath portions of the paint layer were signs of modern substrate reinforcement. Materials that should not have existed according to the painting's recorded history. The evidence accumulated with every image. One inconsistency became 3. 3 became 5. 5 became impossible to explain away. Dr. Graves slowly removed his glasses. For the first time since Claire had met him, he seemed unable to find the right words. Adrian looked toward the monitor once more before turning to the technician. "Are you telling me this painting is not what we believed it was?" The technician hesitated only briefly. "Based on these findings, the documented history cannot be accurate." The room fell silent again. Not the silence of uncertainty. Not the silence of dismissal. This was the silence that arrives when a truth finally becomes impossible to avoid. The laboratory remained silent long after the technician finished speaking. Nobody rushed to fill the emptiness. Nobody argued. The evidence on the screen spoke with a clarity that opinions could not challenge. Claire Whitmore stood motionless, staring at the enlarged images that had changed everything. Just 48 hours earlier, she had been treated as an inconvenience. Now the same observations that drew laughter had exposed a problem worth tens of millions of dollars. Adrian Calloway slowly turned toward the collection's legal director, who had arrived minutes earlier after receiving an urgent call. "I want a complete review of every document connected to this acquisition," he said calmly. "Every report, every authentication record, every transaction." The attorney nodded immediately. Within an hour, conference rooms throughout the building were filled with specialists reviewing years of paperwork. What began as a question about one painting quickly became something much larger. Claire remained in the conservation department while investigators compared authentication reports from multiple institutions. Patterns soon emerged. Certain names appeared repeatedly. The same consultants, the same intermediary brokers, the same independent verification firms. At first the connections seemed coincidental. Then they became impossible to ignore. One report referenced another. One expert cited a previous conclusion instead of conducting a fresh examination. Several evaluations relied heavily on assumptions established years earlier. The deeper the review went, the more fragile the entire chain of verification appeared. Near sunset, Adrian entered the conservation office carrying a thick folder. He looked tired for the first time since Claire had met him. "You were right about something else," he said quietly. Claire looked up from her desk. Adrian placed the folder in front of her. The painting was not the only work authenticated through this network. Claire opened the file. Inside were photographs of additional artwork sold through similar channels over the past decade. Some had been purchased by private collectors. Others hung in respected galleries. The total value exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars. Her eyes widened. "You think they are connected?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Our auditors believe this may be part of a much larger pattern." Claire turned another page. More familiar names appeared. Dealers, consultants, authentication reviewers. None of them looked suspicious individually. Together, however, the connections formed a web that stretched across the industry. The realization settled heavily over the room. This was never about a single mistake. A single mistake would have been easier to explain, easier to forgive. What they were seeing now suggested something far more troubling. Years of assumptions repeated until nobody questioned them anymore. Across the building, phones rang continuously. Attorneys requested records. Insurance companies demanded answers. Independent laboratories began receiving new examination requests. The art world was waking up to a possibility it had never considered. Claire sat quietly with the folder in her lap. She remembered every dismissive smile, every joke, every reminder that she was only maintenance staff. Yet none of those things mattered now. The facts had survived every challenge. Adrian looked through the glass wall toward the busy offices beyond. One overlooked detail uncovered all of this. Claire followed his gaze. Somewhere beyond those walls, reputations were being reevaluated. Careers were being questioned. Institutions were reviewing assumptions they had trusted for years. All because one person refused to stop asking a simple question. And as the investigation expanded beyond a single painting, the truth became impossible to deny. The smallest clue in the room had revealed the biggest story of all. The following weeks transformed the collection in ways nobody could have imagined. Independent laboratories confirmed the original findings. Additional reviews uncovered inconsistencies in multiple authentication records. Industry publications that once celebrated the acquisition now published detailed analyses examining how the errors had gone unnoticed for so long. Throughout it all, Claire Whitmore continued arriving at work each morning the same way she always had. She parked in the same employee lot. She entered through the same service entrance. She carried the same notebook beneath her arm. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. People who once walked past her without a glance now stopped to say hello. Curators asked for her opinion. Conservators invited her into discussions. Even visiting specialists requested meetings. The change was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Claire entered a conference room to retrieve maintenance schedules and paused in surprise. Several familiar faces were already seated inside. Among them sat Victoria Reynolds and Dr. Leonard Graves. The atmosphere felt different from their previous encounters. Gone were the dismissive smiles. Gone was the certainty that had once filled every conversation. Victoria stood first. "Claire, do you have a moment?" Claire nodded cautiously. Victoria took a breath. "I owe you an apology." The words seemed difficult for her to say, yet she continued. "When you raised your concerns, I dismissed them without giving them proper consideration. I should have listened." Claire remained silent. Not because she wanted to make the moment uncomfortable, but because she genuinely did not know how to respond. A few weeks earlier, she never imagined hearing those words. Then Dr. Graves stood. The famous expert appeared older than she remembered. Not physically, simply humbled. "I built my career teaching people to trust evidence," he said quietly. "Somewhere along the way, I became too confident in my own conclusions." He looked directly at her. "You reminded me why evidence matters." The room grew still. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dr. Graves extended his hand. Claire shook it. The gesture lasted only a second, yet everyone in the room understood its meaning. Respect had replaced dismissal. Across the industry, similar conversations were taking place. Institutions reviewed procedures. Authentication standards were strengthened. Several organizations introduced additional verification requirements designed specifically to prevent future oversights. What began with a single observation had become a catalyst for change. Yet the moment that stayed with Claire occurred later that evening. She was walking through the gallery after closing time when she passed the space where the disputed artwork had once hung. The wall stood empty now. Fresh paint covered the area where visitors once gathered to admire certainty. Claire stopped for a moment and looked at the vacant space. Weeks earlier, people had laughed when she questioned what they believed was obvious. Now that empty wall represented something very different. A reminder that expertise matters. But humility matters too. She smiled softly and continued down the corridor. For the first time in a very long while, she no longer felt invisible. Not because people suddenly recognized her, but because the truth she fought to protect had finally been seen. 6 months later, the atmosphere inside the Callaway collection felt completely different. New verification procedures had been implemented throughout the organization. Independent reviews became standard practice. Every acquisition, regardless of value or reputation, underwent deeper material analysis before entering the collection. What had once been considered unnecessary caution was now viewed as essential responsibility. On a quiet autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the gallery windows as visitors moved slowly between exhibits. Some stopped to admire paintings. Others studied historical artifacts. Most had no idea how close the collection had come to building its reputation around a false narrative. Claire Whitmore walked through the gallery carrying a tablet instead of a cleaning cart. Her responsibilities had changed dramatically. Following months of consultations and training reviews, Adrian Calloway had offered her a newly created position within the collection's authentication and conservation department. At first, Claire hesitated. The offer felt unreal. Yet Adrian insisted that the organization needed people willing to question assumptions rather than protect them. Now, each day, Claire worked alongside specialists she once admired from a distance. The difference was that they now respected her as an equal. As she passed through the main exhibition hall, she noticed a group of university students gathered around a display. Their professor was explaining the importance of provenance, scientific testing, and intellectual honesty in art authentication. Claire smiled quietly. Lessons that once lived only inside classrooms were now shaping an entire generation of future experts. Later that afternoon, Adrian joined her near a newly opened exhibition. For a few moments, they simply observed the visitors. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have ended?" Adrian asked. Claire considered the question. "Sometimes." Adrian nodded. "I almost ignored you." Claire laughed softly. "A lot of people did." He looked toward the crowd. "That may have been the most expensive mistake of my life. Fortunately, it became one of the most valuable lessons instead." Adrian smiled. He could not argue with that. Around them, families explored the exhibits while children pointed excitedly at paintings and sculptures. The collection was thriving again, not because it was perfect, but because it had learned from its imperfections. Claire glanced toward the far wall where a new plaque had been installed. It contained a simple statement about integrity, transparency, and the responsibility to follow evidence wherever it leads. Most visitors walked past it without much thought. Claire never did. She understood exactly what those words meant. They represented every moment she had doubted herself, every dismissive comment, every unanswered question, every decision to keep searching when it would have been easier to remain silent. The truth had never depended on her job title. It had never depended on status, wealth, or recognition. It had only depended on someone being willing to see what others overlooked. As the afternoon light settled across the gallery, Claire continued walking among the masterpieces, no longer invisible, no longer unheard. She had not changed the world overnight, but she had reminded a room full of experts that knowledge means very little without humility. And that day, the art world remembered what integrity looks like. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes that truth deserves a voice, no matter where it comes from.